Okay, so get this. We're diving deep into carbon markets today. Like, imagine trading emissions reductions globally.
Mm.
It sounds kind of futuristic, right?
It
But
does.
that's what Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement is all about.
It is. And actually, a recent meeting in Bhutan, of all places, with the Himalayas in the background, it brought us a big step closer to making this market, well, a reality.
It was the 15th meeting of the Supervisory Body. That's SBM 015 for those in the know.
Right.
And they weren't just there for the mountain views. They were really getting down to the nitty-gritty of the rules for this whole new carbon market.
Yeah.
So whether you're like an investor trying to figure this all out,
Yeah.
or you're just, I don't know, someone concerned about climate change who wants to see some action, this deep dive's for you.
Definitely. We'll break down the key outcomes of SBM 015,
Okay.
especially two important documents they put together. One sets the standard for proving emissions reductions are truly, quote, additional, meaning they go above and beyond, just business as usual. And the other outlines how the registry will work, where all those carbon credits are going to be tracked.
Okay, so let's start with this additionality thing.
Yeah.
It sounds a little jargony.
It does.
But why is it such a big deal to ensure these emissions reductions are actually additional?
Well, think about it. It's all about keeping the carbon market honest.
Okay.
Imagine, a company gets credit for reducing emissions that were going to decrease anyway.
Right.
That doesn't help the planet, does it? Additionality makes sure every carbon credit represents a real, measurable climate impact.
So no freebies for doing what they were going to do anyway.
Exactly.
How did SBM 015 actually deal with this?
Wow.
Did they figure out a clear way to determine additionality?
They did. They came up with a whole standard that outlines different methods to prove additionality. Some look at the finances of a project, like, would this even happen without the money from carbon credits? Others look at barriers, regulations, technology limits, things the carbon market could help to overcome.
I'm starting to see how this gets complex.
It does.
Can you give us like a real-world example? How would additionality actually be assessed?
Sure. Let's say a company, maybe in a developing country, wants to build a wind farm.
Okay.
They could potentially sell those emissions reductions, as the carbon credits.
Right.
But to prove those reductions are additional, they might need to show they couldn't get funding for that wind farm without the extra money from selling carbon credits.
Okay.
Or maybe they'd show that the rules make it really hard to connect renewable energy to the grid, and that the carbon market incentive is what helps them overcome that.
So it's about the project, but also the whole context around it.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Now, let's jump to this global registry thing.
Right.
Sounds like something out of sci-fi, right?
It kind of does.
A digital ledger for the entire planet's carbon credits.
It is pretty remarkable. At SBM 15, they adopted the procedure for this registry.
Okay.
It's basically a massive database that tracks every single carbon credit under Article 6.4, how they're issued, transferred, retired, even canceled.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
Yeah.
Why is this registry so important?
It all comes down to, transparency and accountability.
Okay.
Think about it. If you're an investor putting money into a carbon offset project,
Right.
wouldn't you want to be able to track those credits, make sure they're legit and really cutting emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be like investing in a company without seeing their financials.
Exactly.
So this registry helps ensure everyone's playing by the rules, and those carbon credits are the real deal.
That's the idea. And they're not just talking about it either. SBM 15 actually launched a test version of the registry during the meeting.
Oh, wow.
It's early stages, but shows they're serious about getting this going.
Okay, so we've got the rules for proving emissions reductions are really making a difference, and we've got a system for tracking those reductions globally. What else did SBM 15 cover?
Well, they also got into some tricky stuff like transitioning from the clean development mechanism.
Oh, right, the CDM.
Yeah, the old carbon market under the Kyoto Protocol.
Yeah.
They're figuring out how to bring over certain projects, but with a much higher bar for environmental integrity, especially for those emissions removal projects, from forests and things.
That seems like a good idea, learning from the past, making sure this new market avoids the old pitfalls.
Definitely.
Okay, so anything else?
Well, they also focused on the needs of least developed countries and small island developing states. Those countries really facing the brunt of climate change,
Yeah.
but often lacking the resources to adapt. So SBM 15 gave them the option to be exempt from sharing some of the proceeds from carbon credit sales.
That's a big step in making sure this market is fair. It could bring more investment to those countries that need it most.
Mhm.
But I heard there's some debate about how long this exemption should last.
Yeah, there is some worry that a permanent exemption might actually discourage investment in adaptation projects and create an uneven playing field. It's a tricky balance between helping those vulnerable countries and making sure the market is effective long term.
Right. Of course, there's always the risk of, like, shady actors trying to manipulate the system, right?
There is.
How did SBM 15 deal with that?
They started looking into how to set up really strong know your customer checks
Ah, okay.
to prevent fraud and money laundering. Think of it like anti-money laundering, but for carbon credits. They want to make sure everyone involved is legit and the transactions are transparent.
So building in safeguards from the start, that's good. But this is still, a new and complex system.
It is.
What does it all mean for someone trying to get their head around this whole new carbon market landscape?
Well, I think SDM 15 was a key step in creating a framework for Article 6.4 to actually work. They've laid the groundwork for a system that could drive significant emissions reductions and help countries achieve their climate goals. The big test is how this actually gets implemented in practice.
That's where the rubber meets the road, right?
Yeah, it is.
And that's what we'll dig into in part 2 of this deep dive. We'll look closer at the details of these standards and procedures and what they mean for investors, businesses, anyone who cares about, well, the future of our planet.
Exactly. It's fascinating, how these kind of abstract concepts actually play out in the real world.
Yeah.
Like that standard on additionality, it
Yeah.
gets super specific about what companies and countries actually have to prove.
So let's break that down a bit. What are some of the specifics? What are they going to be looking at to decide if a project is really additional?
Well, first of all, no more vague claims or wishful thinking.
Okay.
The standard wants hard evidence.
Right.
For example, like if a project developer says, hey, my wind farm is additional because I couldn't get financing,
Right.
they can't just say that. They need to prove those barriers actually stop them from going ahead without that carbon credit revenue.
Okay.
It's not enough to say, oh, it was hard to get a loan. They need to show a detailed analysis of why traditional financing just wasn't going to happen.
So it's not just about having a good idea. You got to demonstrate that the carbon market is like the key that unlocks the whole thing.
Exactly. And then there's the investment analysis. They look at things like capital expenditure, operating costs, projected revenues, even potential cost savings.
Wow.
They even insist on something called a sensitivity analysis, which basically stress tests the numbers
Okay.
to see if the project would still make sense if some of the assumptions change.
So they're really making sure the numbers add up,
Yeah,
that the project wouldn't work without the carbon credit incentive.
right. And the whole time, the emphasis is on being conservative.
Okay.
No overestimating those emissions reductions, making sure those credits represent a real, verified climate benefit.
No inflating the numbers to make things look better than they are.
Yeah.
I like that. Now, what about the registry itself?
Right.
We talk about tracking these carbon credits, but how's it actually going to work? What kind of information is it going to be keeping track of?
The level of detail is impressive. They've thought of everything, different types of accounts, procedures for transactions, even how to keep the whole system secure.
Okay.
It's about making sure the accounting is airtight, no double counting.
Double counting. Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Why is that such a big concern?
Imagine like a country sells the same emissions reduction twice.
Right.
It completely undermines the whole market.
Right.
The registry prevents that by, tracking the ownership and status of every single credit.
So it's like a giant tamper-proof accounting system for the planet's carbon reductions.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And it's not just about tracking credits internally.
Yeah, okay.
The registry also has to talk to other systems, like the one for internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. It gets into how countries adjust their emissions accounting when they're buying or selling credits on the international market.
Okay, that sounds pretty complex. Can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure. So remember, the Paris Agreement wants countries to make pledges to reduce their emissions.
Right.
Those are called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs.
Right.
Article 6 lets countries work together to achieve those NDCs. And that's where carbon markets come in.
So a country that's doing really well, exceeding their targets, could sell credits to a country that's struggling.
Exactly. But the accounting has to be clear. If a country sells a carbon credit, They have to deduct that from their own inventory. Otherwise, you'd have both countries claiming the same reduction.
Yeah, that would defeat the whole purpose of trying to reduce global emissions.
Exactly. That's where this first transfer idea comes in.
Okay.
When a credit is transferred for the first time, it triggers this adjustment in the selling country's accounting.
Right.
The registry keeps track of this to make sure everything adds up.
So they've got these safeguards to prevent any funny business.
They do. It's complex with lots of moving parts, but it's designed to be as transparent and accountable as possible.
Now, I know all this talk of registries and accounting can be, well, a bit dry for some people.
It can.
But let's zoom out for a sec. How does this actually help us fight climate change?
Good question. The Paris Agreement, remember, wants to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees compared to, pre-industrial levels.
Yeah.
Getting there requires a huge global effort to cut those greenhouse gas emissions.
And Article 6, including the 6.4 mechanism, is supposed to be a part of that solution.
Right. The idea is that these carbon markets can help countries speed up their climate action.
Right.
By putting a price on carbon, you create a financial reason to reduce emissions.
Uh-huh.
It unlocks investments in clean tech and sustainable development.
Okay.
And by letting countries work together, trade these emissions reductions, they can potentially get those reductions more efficiently.
So it's not about punishing polluters.
No.
It's about incentivizing everyone to find the most cost-effective ways to reduce emissions globally.
That's the idea anyway.
Yeah.
But it all depends on the integrity and effectiveness of the market itself.
Right.
That's why these standards and procedures that SBM 15 talked about are so important.
Right.
They're trying to build a system that's strong, transparent, and actually delivers real climate benefits.
No pressure. Right. Now, one thing that really stood out to me in the SBM 15 outcomes was the focus on emissions removals,
Yeah.
especially from forests.
Yeah.
This seems particularly tricky.
It is. Forests are these amazing carbon sinks, right?
Mhm.
They suck up huge amounts of CO2.
Right.
So protecting forests and planting new ones, that can be a big part of fighting climate change.
Yeah,
But there are a lot of potential problems.
I can imagine. Trees can be cut down. They can get diseases, pests. Even if they grow well, how do you even measure how much carbon they're absorbing?
All valid points. And then you have land use issues, impacts on biodiversity, local communities. If you're planting these huge single-species plantations, you could actually do more harm than good.
So how are they trying to navigate all this within the Article 6.4 framework?
They're coming up with specific methodologies and standards for those activities involving removals,
Okay.
requirements for monitoring, reporting, verification,
Mm-hmm.
making sure the emissions reductions are real and permanent.
Okay.
And they're addressing environmental and social safeguards to protect ecosystems and communities.
So it's not just about planting trees. It's about planting the right trees in the right way and making sure they thrive long term.
Exactly. And it needs collaboration, governments, developers, verifiers, and really importantly, those local communities who are actually affected by these projects.
Sounds like a huge task, but a really important one.
It is, and it's something we'll keep an eye on as this market develops, as these emissions removal activities under Article 6.4 start to take off.
Now, another thing from SBM 15 was the talk about transitioning from the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, that old carbon market. They're letting some projects move over to Article 6.4, but they're being super cautious about it. Why is that?
Well, the CDM had its problems.
Okay.
The concerns about the additionality of some projects,
Right.
questions about whether they were really delivering those emissions reductions,
Mm-hmm.
and criticisms about the environmental and social safeguards. Some projects had negative impacts on communities or biodiversity.
So they're trying to learn from the past, avoid repeating those mistakes.
Exactly. They've got specific criteria for projects transitioning from the CDM.
Okay.
Strict requirements for showing additionality and complying with these new environmental and social standards.
And they're being especially cautious about those emissions removal projects, right?
Absolutely. Given all the complexities and risks we just talked about, they're being extra careful to make sure those projects meet the highest standards. Environmental integrity and all that.
So no free pass for old projects.
Right?
They have to prove they're up to scratch with these new rules.
That's a good way to put it. And that scrutiny is a good thing. It shows they're taking this seriously, trying to build a credible and effective market.
Speaking of making this market fair and effective, we talked about how SBM 15 gave those least developed countries and small island developing states that exemption from sharing some of the proceeds.
Right.
But there's debate about whether that should be permanent or just temporary. What are the arguments there?
It's tough. On one hand, these countries, they're hit hardest by climate change.
Yeah,
Often they don't have the resources to invest in adaptation.
right.
Giving them this financial help through the exemption could be huge for their climate resilience.
And it seems right, ethically, to acknowledge, those historical inequalities, give extra support to those who cause this problem the least, but are suffering the most.
Right. But on the other hand, there's the worry that a permanent exemption could mess with the market, discourage investment in those countries. If buyers know they can get a better deal elsewhere, they might not invest in projects in LDCs and SIDs, even if those projects are really good for the environment and communities.
So it's about finding that balance. You want to help those vulnerable countries, but you also want the market to work properly, drive investment where it's needed.
Exactly. It's a tough one, and it's something the supervisory body will have to keep working on as they develop these rules.
Now, we can't talk about carbon markets without, addressing the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
The risk of bad actors,
Right.
fraud, manipulation, money laundering.
Yeah.
How's SBM 15 dealing with that?
They're taking it seriously. They've started looking into know your customer checks, like what's used in finance.
So it's about making sure the people in market are legit.
Yeah.
The transactions are transparent, traceable.
Exactly. They want to keep out those shady operators, make sure every carbon credit represents a real emissions cut.
But even with the best intentions, the best rules, there will always be people trying to game the system.
Right. Unfortunately, it's a constant battle.
Yeah.
But the important thing is the supervisory body knows about these risks. They're taking steps to stop them. They're not naive about the potential for abuse.
Well, it's a reminder to be realistic.
Yeah.
Building a global carbon market that's fair, effective, and stops abuse, it's a huge task.
It is. But the outcomes from SBM 15 show they're making progress step by step. They're building this system that could, if done right, play a big part in tackling climate change.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on the Article 6.4 mechanism registry again.
Okay.
Such a crucial part of all this. What are some of the details they've been working on to make sure this registry is solid and reliable?
It's quite interesting, actually. They've thought about everything.
Okay.
The different types of accounts, how credits are transferred, the security, keep it safe from tampering. It's a complex system, but it's designed to be transparent and accountable.
One thing that stood out to me was the different account types. It's not just a one-size-fits-all thing, is it?
No, not at all. They've got separate accounts for different purposes because this market is so diverse. For instance, there's a pending account. That's where new credits go before they can be transferred or used.
So it's like a holding area until they're checked and verified.
Exactly. Then you have holding accounts for countries, companies, even the adaptation fund. They can store and manage their credits there.
And there are also specific accounts for cancellations, right?
Yes. Remember, Article 6.4 has those mandatory cancellations to make sure global emissions are actually reduced overall.
Right.
So there's an account just for that.
Yeah.
Those credits are gone for good, no double counting.
So it's like a black hole for carbon credits. They just disappear forever.
That's one way to put it. And then you have accounts for voluntary cancellations, too.
Okay.
Where someone can choose to retire credits, maybe to contribute to climate goals or offset their own emissions.
It sounds like a pretty complete system. Every credit is tracked, and it's clear what it's being used for.
That's the goal. They've also put a lot of thought into how those transactions happen, making sure it's secure, transparent, and can be audited. Every step of the way, there's a record of who owns what and what they're doing with it.
I'm really interested in this first transfer concept we talked about. It seems like a key part of preventing that double counting.
It is. Remember, under Article 6, countries have to adjust their emissions accounting when they transfer credits.
Right. So if a country sells a credit, they have to deduct that amount from their own inventory. So they're not claiming the same reduction twice.
Exactly. And that first transfer label is what starts that adjustment.
Okay.
The registry tracks that to make sure the accounting is right and transparent.
So it's like a safety net to stop creative accounting. Make sure the system's honest.
Exactly. And they've even built in some flexibility to accommodate, different situations countries might have.
Okay.
For example, there's this thing called post-issuance authorization and changes of authorization. It lets countries adjust how they use different types of credits.
Okay. This is where I start to get lost. Can you explain that in a simpler way?
Sure. Remember we talked about those two types of credits, AERs and MCUs?
Vaguely. Remind me, what's the difference again?
AERs, those are specifically for a country's climate targets, their NDCs.
Right.
MCUs can be used for other things, like supporting sustainable development projects.
Okay, got it. So how does this post-issuance authorization relate to those types of credits?
Well, the registry lets MCUs be converted into AERs after they've been issued if they meet certain conditions. It's like an upgrade path for those credits.
Interesting. So a country could earn MCUs for a project that helps with sustainable development.
Right.
And then later, if they need to, they can switch those into AERs to help them hit their emissions reduction targets.
Exactly. And they can also change the authorization of AERs, like if a country decides to use them for something different than they originally planned.
So there's some flexibility built in.
There is. It shows how complex this all is, the Article 6.4 rules, and the decisions countries make themselves.
This whole registry is a huge undertaking. It's like they're making a whole new financial system for the planet. But it sounds like they're really thinking it through, making sure it's robust, transparent, and adaptable.
They are, and that's encouraging. It shows they're serious about building a market that can really help us fight climate change.
Now, while we're on the topic of building this new market, I want to talk about the human side of this.
Okay.
We've been talking about the technical stuff, Article 6.4. But its success depends on something bigger than just rules and regs, right?
Yeah. You're talking about political will, collective action. All this is pointless if countries and companies aren't actually committed to cutting emissions.
Exactly. We can have the best carbon market in the world.
Right.
But if there's no real commitment to tackling climate change, it's not going to matter.
Absolutely. And that brings us to the big question. Can Article 6.4 live up to the hype?
Yeah.
Can it really drive those emissions reductions we need? Or will it just be another way for companies and countries to greenwash and keep doing business as usual?
Those are the million-dollar questions.
Yeah.
And the answer really comes down to the choices we make as individuals, businesses, nations.
Will we take this chance to build a truly sustainable future where the economy grows and we protect the environment?
Yeah.
Or will we mess it up with short-sightedness and self-interest?
The stakes are high. The next few years will decide which path we choose.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up our look at the complexities of Article 6.4.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? We can build these fancy systems, write all these detailed rules, but in the end, it's about us.
It is.
Human choices and whether we work together.
Absolutely. And that leads to even more questions, right? Like, what'll it actually take to get everyone on board, to get the political will and the momentum to make these markets really effective?
Right.
How do we make sure everything's transparent and accountable, not just in the market itself, but, in every part of the economy?
And how do we avoid that greenwashing trap?
Right.
Companies or countries trying to look good without actually doing the work?
Exactly. These are the tough conversations we need to have. We need to look beyond the technical stuff and think bigger.
Yeah.
The ethical side of things, the potential impact on society, the economy.
And we have to remember there's no one magic solution.
Right.
What works in one place might not work somewhere else. We need to be flexible, adapt, and learn from what works and what doesn't.
It's a constant process, right? Experimenting, refining, we're figuring it out as we go along.
Yeah.
But we need to be bold, we need to act. The climate crisis won't wait,
Yeah.
even with all the uncertainty and complexity.
So what does all this mean for people listening, for people trying to understand this whole carbon market thing?
Yeah.
What can they actually do? How can they get involved?
Well, first, stay informed.
Okay.
Pay attention to how these markets are developing, the rules, who the players are. Ask questions about the projects and companies that say they're climate friendly. Don't be afraid to push back, to demand transparency.
Don't underestimate the power of your own choices and actions either. How you vote, how you invest, what you buy, all of that matters.
It does.
You can support companies and policies that are building a sustainable future.
And don't forget collective action. Join organizations, movements pushing for change. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues about these issues. The more we understand these complex systems, the better we can hold people accountable, the better we can demand real action.
It reminds us that we're all in this together.
We are.
The choices we make today will determine the world we leave behind. We can't ignore that responsibility.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into Article 6.4.
Yes, it's been quite a journey exploring this whole world of carbon markets. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful. We can create a better future, but we need to work together to get there.